Welcome to Module 6 and the sixth mini lecture of the semester and the final one. So we're looking in this module at the Cold War and the remaking of Europe. So look at your textbook there, chapter 27, I believe that is. The big theme here is how to avoid, leaders wanted to avoid the chaos that had followed after World War I. They just endured another war, World War II, and they were well aware of what had happened after World War I, when you had that Spanish flu epidemic and when you had the rise of radicalism and revolutions. And they wanted to avoid that sort of chaos after World War II and do things a bit differently. Of course, one thing that will be quite different is that the United States will become more assertive in the world after World War II, especially in Europe, where it will set up permanent military bases in those defeated Axis power countries, such as Germany and Italy. The other big reality here is, of course, the splitting of Europe between the Soviet Union and the states that are allied with the United States. This is the Cold War. And what would be described as well, that descending of the Iron Curtain that happens in the late 1940s when the Soviet Union seals off all those borders in those Eastern European countries to contact with the West. There was a lot of optimism after the defeat of fascism in lots of different respects. Even in the Soviet Union, your textbook talks about the publication of the Pasternak's novel Dr. Zhivago, which was a hopeful sort of story. It was a story about the Russian Revolution, but it shows the more human side of the Russian Revolution, and certainly doesn't show it in the most positive of lights. That's why the Soviet Union tried to ban the book, or did ban the book for a number of years. Soviets initially are going to forbid its publication. But that gets to the nature of what you've been reading about in that book by Drkulik, The Museum of Communism. Life in the Soviet bloc countries was very curtailed, very totalitarian, meaning the states tried to, the communist governments that come into power in all of those Eastern European countries are trying to create a communist state and culture. Stalin's plan is to create one solid communist culture from the Soviet Union to Berlin, right, all across those Eastern European countries. But as you see from the tales that are told by all of those animals in a museum of communism, a tour through the Museum of Communism, there was a lot of variety in those various countries. A lot of variety of the way, it kind of depended upon the whims of the dictator and the personality of the dictator in each of the individual countries. For example, you had Marshal Tito in Yugoslavia and South Eastern Europe, there where World War I had actually begun, and he's a bit of a playboy, you might say, as the book points out, in a museum of communism. I'll make another short lecture, though, on the book, so I won't spend too much time here talking about that. But be aware that Stalin wants to create this single communist culture, eradicating the different nationalist cultures in those areas, of Eastern Europe. He does this with kind of limited success, as you learn from a tour through the Museum of Communism. There's a lot of diversity, but there are some constants though. One constant across Eastern Europe is dictatorship and totalitarianism. So look over those sections in your textbook on what happens in Eastern Europe. Germany is divided, of course, after World War I, and it will be what I call ground zero in the Cold War, the Brandenburg Gate right there in the middle of Berlin. It's hard to overestimate or exaggerate the tumult, the chaos in Europe after World War II, and how in some ways the story of both American intervention with the Marshall Plan, which is a big package of aid to Europe, but also what Europeans did for themselves after World War II in creating what would become known as welfare states. Now, welfare states are a little different than what you might just think of as welfare. Welfare states, providing what we would call welfare to unemployed people and to people in poverty, and even to homeless people. That was part of it, but that was only a small part of what welfare states were trying to do. Welfare states were trying to create a more stable and fair economy, and it was a way of trying to find a middle ground between kind of free market fundamentalism on one side, and that kind of represented by the United States, but even the United States at that time was in some ways more liberal than it is today when it came to these policies of creating a welfare state. But the purpose of the welfare state was not just to benefit poor people and working class people, but it was to create stability and economic stability and create a third way between free market capitalism and communism on the other extreme. So this was thought of as a third way. And it seemed to work pretty well because there was a lot of concern that a lot of voters in some of these very impoverished countries after World War II, such as in Italy, even France to an extent, and Germany, that their workers might turn to far left political parties, to communism, in order to get a fair shake, in order to secure for themselves decent incomes and livings. But by the 1950s and certainly by the 1960s, communist parties in the Western Europe are really declining in numbers, and they're really going to be on the political edges. The creation of the welfare state seemed to help to stem that tide of political radicalism that we had seen after World War I. And just to give you an idea of some of the other things that the welfare state did, it sought to improve housing conditions. And think about how much of these cities and that were destroyed by the war. So government would take a role in housing and public housing. They would take a role in providing health care and making sure that people were all covered by health care. Medicine as well would be covered, prescription drugs. Employment would be tackled as well by greater government regulation of the economy. Many countries in Western Europe are going to nationalize certain industry. Now, this is kind of a socialist, or it is a kind of socialistic way of going about running the economy, or at least those industries that were seen to be too important to leave in the hands of private individuals. So governments will take over things like the electrical grid, transportation systems, railways. Even in Britain and in France as well, you had governments taking over the petroleum industry. This would later become privatized as British Petroleum, but it was nationalized for a while in the 1950s. So it was steel in some countries as well. So the goals of the welfare state were quite broad: housing, employment, medical insurance, and even support for the family. One of the problems that governments identified after World War II, was actually a drop in the birth rate. And they wanted populations to grow, so they started offering basically benefits, childcare benefits for people who have children. This was particularly the case in France, where they had a really low birth rate. And I would point as well to the election in 1945, right after World War II ends in Great Britain, of a guy by the name of Clement Attlee, 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 Clement Attlee, who is the first Labour Party prime minister with a real ironclad majority in Parliament, which meant he could legislate and pass this kind of legislation to implement the welfare state. So that's what Clement Attlee does, and similar leaders all around Western Europe. There's this new political consensus that welfare states are the way to go. So look at those sections in your textbook on the creation of welfare states. The other theme to this time period in the 1950s and 1960s is, of course, the decolonization of the world, or the drawing down of these European empires. India will be the first large country to get its independence after World War II in 1947, largely through the efforts of Gandhi and his political party there. Other countries will also gain independence, not always peacefully. Some of these countries win independence by basically revolution or insurgency. This is what you saw in France, in Vietnam, in the war against the French there in the 1950s, sort of a precursor to the guerrilla war that the United States will face there about 10 years later, after the French pull out. Then the Americans come in and fight another war. African countries tended to be the last of the countries to be granted independence, again, not always peacefully. One of the problems that occurs whenever there is a big change in power like this is, who's going to step in and rule these countries once the European empires have left. So some of these places will suffer from civil wars, in fact, after decolonization. This would be the case in places like Sri Lanka, for example. The other thing that I should mention is the need for greater and greater economic cooperation in Europe. And this was created in 1957 with the Treaty of Rome and the EEC, the European Economic Community, that will later become the European Union and a single currency market. Early on, it was just a free trade zone for heavy industry goods such as steel and coal. But later it will be extended to more and more groups. So the dream of a more united Europe comes, at the time when they're trying to recover from World War I. And again, it was seen as a way of addressing some of the problems that had gone so badly wrong after World War I. Remember how the Great Depression was made worse by countries throwing up tariffs between them and cutting off a global trade. The EEC is a way in which to avoid those sorts of trade wars. I know there's a lot of news lately about the struggles of the European Union. But in many ways, the European Union, at least in the short and medium term, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, has to be seen in a lot of ways as a success, because it does seem to bring economic stability to these regions, and even by the 1960s and 70s, prosperity. So look at those sections as well on the Treaty of Rome, the European Economic Community, and why it was formed and how it was formed. Okay, so those are just some of the things we're looking at this section. I'm going to leave you with that, and this will be my last of these mini lectures. I'll have a short presentation on tour through the Museum of Communism. All right. Happy reading, and I'll see you on the discussion boards.
Video recording button.